In the world of music, few names shine as brightly as Elvis Presley. Yet behind the flash of stage lights and the roar of his fans, a different story unfolded, one that led him from the stages of Vegas to the barracks of the army. In 1957, a simple piece of paper changed everything. It was Elvis' draft notice, a call to serve his country that no amount of fame could dodge. Elvis was not the typical conscript. Most young men of his time saw the draft as a necessary evil or a chance to escape an unwanted life. But for Elvis, it was both a shock and an opportunity. Born into a working-class family, he knew the value of service, even if it meant leaving his music career temporarily on hold. His world was about to change in ways he couldn't imagine. Conscription, or the draft, is an old idea. It dates back to ancient Egypt, where every able-bodied man had to serve in the military. Today, many countries still use it, though not all require everyone. Some pick names out of a hat, like a big, serious game of chance. Others let you skip out if you study medicine or take care of your family. But in the 1950s, the draft was serious business. If you were a young man, fit, and within a certain age range, you had to sign up. Exemptions existed, like being a doctor or a farmer, but for most, it was a given. Some, like singers Frank Sinatra and Dick Haymes, tried to avoid it, but their excuses were either silly or easy to check. Sinatra had a fake allergy and Haymes was born abroad. Neither fooled anyone. Elvis's draft was different. He wasn't trying to escape, he was ready to serve. But why join the army? For Elvis, it was a mix of duty and savvy. Colonel Parker, his manager, saw it as a smart move. It could boost his image and open doors he couldn't reach with just music. Plus, the army offered training, discipline, and a structured life, things Elvis, with his wild youth, might have needed. When Elvis received his draft notice, it was like a punch to the gut. He had just started filming King Creole and was set to make a movie in New Orleans. But Colonel Parker stepped in, as he always did, and sorted it out. Elvis would join after the film, giving him a small window to continue his career. Elvis's first days in the army were at Graceland, his newly bought mansion. It was a surreal start, snow falling outside while he celebrated Christmas with family inside, but the joy was short-lived. A week later, $1,000 vanished from his large denominations pile. No Cadillacs or jewelry, just a mystery thief. Elvis suspected it was someone trying to cause trouble, perhaps linked to his new military life. Despite this, Elvis received a deferment until March, thanks to President Eisenhower's note. It was a polite way of saying, "You're joining the army, kid." Elvis saw this as his chance to prove himself. He wasn't going to get special treatment. He would serve like any other soldier, even if that meant a very different military life. The army was a world away from the glitz of Hollywood. Elvis would soon learn the hard way that being a soldier meant following orders without question. His time in the army was unique, full of challenges, changes, and a journey that would forever alter his path. But that's a story for another time. After the devastating war, many hoped for peace. People believed this terrible conflict would never happen again. In the US, they stopped making people join the army, but in the UK, they kept it. This was a big change from the wartime when the US, Britain, and the Soviet Union had worked together, though uneasily, against their common enemy. But this alliance did not last. The Soviet Union began to spread communism in Eastern Europe, setting up new governments in the countries they said they had liberated. This made both Britain and the US very suspicious. They worried that the Soviets wanted to share their ideas all over the world. It wasn't just about fighting with armies, it was also about winning hearts and minds through ideas. Propaganda became a big tool. People in Hollywood, like many others, feared communists. Senator Joe McCarthy became famous for chasing communists, especially in Hollywood, in what were called witch hunts. This fear reached its peak in the early 1950s. Two strong leaders, Winston Churchill and Harry Truman, came up with words to describe this tense time. Churchill talked about the Iron Curtain, a way of saying that Eastern Europe was closed off from the West. George Orwell, a famous writer, talked about a Cold War, meaning a war without fighting with guns but with ideas and influence. This Cold War led to the creation of NATO, a group of countries that promised to protect each other. They believed that if one country in Europe was attacked, it was like attacking them all. The US suggested a treaty to stop nuclear testing, but it was hard to get the Soviet Union to agree because they had just tested their own nuclear bombs. After World War II, Japan could no longer control Korea. The country split, with the North backed by the Soviet Union and the South by the US. In 1950, the North attacked the South. The US, with help from the United Nations and troops from Britain, joined to defend South Korea. For the first time, the US allowed students to stay in school instead of joining the army. The conflict in Korea got complicated when China warned they would intervene if the US pushed too far. Then, the death of Soviet leader Stalin seemed to ease things a bit. For a short while, the Soviet Union seemed less strict. In 1953, an armistice was signed, stopping the fighting, and the two Koreas remained separate. Nikita Khrushchev took over in the Soviet Union after Stalin. He criticized Stalin but still wanted the Soviet Union to be a big player in the world. He felt humiliated if he couldn't match the US's power. In a funny twist, while visiting the US, Khrushchev was shown a movie about freedom that ended up making him see America in a different light. He mocked the film but also recognized the allure of American culture to Soviet citizens. Around this time, the split between the Soviet Union and China opened up some space for the West. The US tried to get closer to the Soviet leader, inviting him to visit. However, things went sideways when Khrushchev visited a movie set and was mocked by American entertainers. This incident highlighted the cultural differences and tensions between the two superpowers. Despite the tension, some positive exchanges happened. For example, Elvis Presley's music reached Soviet ears, even though listening to it was forbidden. Young Soviet soldiers dreamed of the freedom they heard in Elvis's songs, which were a symbol of American culture. This cultural exchange showed that even in a time of great tension, people were drawn to the freedoms represented by Western culture. Back in the US, figures like President Eisenhower later regretted the arms race and the idea of mutually assured destruction, where both sides had enough nuclear weapons to destroy each other. It was a costly peace paid for by taxes, and it made everyone nervous. The peace was also tested closer to home. In Hungary in 1956, people rose up against Soviet rule. Russian tanks were sent in, and many protesters were killed. Even celebrities like Elvis Presley and Willie Mays were affected, as they were called to serve in the army, showing that the draft was still very much in place. Despite the threat of nuclear war, some argued that conscription or the draft should continue. They said it kept people willing to serve and allowed some control over where they were sent. Elvis Presley, seen as a clean-cut American hero, eventually served in the army, which was a big deal. It was seen as a chance for him to become a real hero and to show off his talents to a wider audience. Overall, the post-war era was marked by a delicate balance of power and a constant fear of nuclear war, all while cultures clashed and influenced each other in unexpected ways. Let's talk about the time Elvis Presley joined the army and the big impact this had, not just on him but on many others too. In 1958, when Elvis joined, the United States was involved in a war. This made people like Colonel Parker, Elvis's manager, think twice about sending him to fight. They were worried about losing their star. But Parker felt safe thinking Elvis would come back alive. If it had been a few years later, especially with the Vietnam War looming, Parker likely would have been more hesitant. The thought of losing Elvis was not something anyone wanted, especially knowing how much money he could make even after he died. Elvis joining the army put Colonel Parker in a tough spot, especially when it came to Germany. Germany was split into different parts controlled by the US, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union after World War II. Being close to the Soviet border wasn't ideal for Parker, as it meant Elvis would be far from home and out of Parker's direct control. This was worrying because Germany was a tense place, right next to the Soviet zone, with the risk of war always looming. During this time, singers like Eddie Fisher and Clyde McPhatter recorded music while serving in the military, but Parker didn't like this idea. He wanted Elvis to focus on music, not military duties. Other stars like Buddy Knox and the Everly Brothers also served but faced their challenges, like having to stop performing and dealing with Army rules. The draft or conscription was a big deal in both the US and the UK. In the UK, every man between 18 and 26 had to do national service, serving 2 years actively and 4 years in the reserves. Even famous athletes like cricket player Colin Cowdrey faced rejection because of a small health issue, showing how serious the UK took national service. There were funny and sad stories about the draft. For example, Terry Denay, a singer, joined the army despite knowing he wasn't fit. He ended up in a military hospital and was later told he shouldn't have joined. This was a huge embarrassment for him and the army. Marty Wilde also dodged the draft thanks to medical excuses, which helped his career. The fear of war, especially with the Soviets building missiles in Cuba, made many Americans question the draft. Some went to Canada to avoid it, and the draft even affected famous people like John Lennon, though he never had to serve. The draft also had unexpected benefits, like turning the Cray twins into gangsters. Then came the Vietnam War, which divided the US heavily. Many opposed it, leading to draft dodging and burning draft cards, seen as acts of bravery rather than cowardice. Some, like singer Jesse Winchester, moved to Canada to avoid the draft. The war in Vietnam was another big issue, with famous boxer Muhammad Ali refusing to serve, leading to a long legal battle. He was eventually vindicated, but the war had already ended, and he was too old to fight anyway. In simple terms, the draft and wars during this period affected many lives, from musicians to athletes and even ordinary people who wanted to avoid fighting. It changed careers, moved people to different countries, and sparked debates about freedom and duty. Elvis's decision to join the army was just one part of a much larger story about how war and national service shaped a generation.